Hey, this is Dancing Rabbit. Welcome to another Saturday Pagan Perspective. Books of shadows, grimoires, journals. First, a little bit of the history. During the Middle Ages, the alchemists and the folks who were practicing ceremonial magic compiled their information, their formulas, their incantations, diagrams of talismans that they had used into books called grimoires. These people were more or less literate, and so passing down information in written form made sense. The term Book of Shadows comes from Gardner, the founder of Wica. In the 1920s, 30s, 40s, or early 50s, when he was putting together what has become Wicca, he wrote down his information, his rituals, his thoughts on the gods and the goddesses in a book which he called a Book of Light and Shadows. The idea is that we pagans don't view light as good, dark as evil, but we view a balance, an alternation between light and dark as harmony, as what we're striving for. So Gardner wrote down his Wiccan rituals. And if you were going to join one of his covens, one of the things in your first couple of years as an apprentice would be the task of hand copying the coven, the traditional Book of Shadows, into your own Book of Shadows. Now, as folks branched off from Gardnerian Wicca, Alex Sanders and other people, they took the Book of Shadows and they made some changes and some additions, and it became their traditional Book of Shadows. Coming on up a little more to the present time, people, especially in the United States, were unable to find Gardnerian covens to join, and with especially Raymond Buckland's publications, began to read about Wicca and paganism and began to practice on their own and began to write their own books of shadows. Now, when I began practicing paganism about 16 years ago, I'd been to a couple of workshops and I'd bought a couple of books, and when I got home I was reading them. I started checking out more books from the library, and I began my Book of Shadows. It was in a 3-ring binder on notebook paper with a number 2 pencil. And so what I did is I took notes from the different books that I had, and very much like when I would be writing a term paper or a theme, some of it was copied verbatim, some of it was summaries of what was in the books. I did this for a couple of years. I've never been very good at journaling. I've tried it a few times, but I've never been able to keep it up for very long. So my first Book of Shadows was more of a grimoire than a journal. When I helped form the first group that I worked with, the Elder Grove, the first few rituals I wrote, and I put them into a group Book of Shadows that was available to all the members. And as time went on, various other members began writing rituals, and I would take the printed copy and put it into our group Book of Shadows. And then I changed jobs and I moved to Texas, and for several years I really wasn't involved in any group work, and I had acquired quite a library of pagan books, and so my Book of Shadow work sort of stopped, became dormant. When we got to Houston a couple of years later, my wife and I formed another group which is called Rhythm of Life, and in the beginning we wrote most of the rituals, and so I had written copies of these rituals which went into the group Book of Shadows. As time went on and we had more experience and more experienced people joined, we began passing the job of writing around, and a lot of times what I got was not a complete word-for-word written out ritual, but an outline or possibly just my part in the ritual. So none of this stuff was written down, and my book of shadow writing sort of fizzled out again. Now when I wrote my book, Way of the Horned God, I wrote rituals on the computer, not in a 3-ring binder, because it's a whole lot easier to edit. It's easier to copy and paste things into it that way. And I'd write a ritual, I'd try it out, I'd modify it, and so forth. And eventually it ended up in book form. So what of my personal book of shadows? Well, I guess the controversial thing I'd like to say is right now I don't keep a book of shadows. And when this topic came up, I kind of felt bad. Here I am, the great unfamous pagan author, and I don't even have a book of shadows. What kind of example is that? I think that it depends. What you do depends on your circumstance, and what works for you is what you should continue to do. Now for me, right now, keeping a written book of shadows just doesn't seem to work. I'm not borrowing books from the public library that I have to take notes from. I'm not currently doing a lot of ritual writing. I'm doing some of what I've done, and the rituals, the spells, the formulas, the correspondences, I've basically memorized. And I can do them without referring back to a written book. Now, is this a bad thing? No, I don't think it necessarily is. The folk magic that is mainly what I practice wasn't originally written. It was passed as an oral tradition. My mother's great-great-grandmother was an herbalist, and unfortunately, for whatever reason, she didn't pass her knowledge and her practice on to anybody. And so all we have is the family story about Granny Sarah Martin going out into the hills and the woods and gathering plants and not telling anybody what she was doing and concocting various herbal remedies that seemed to work. So along that tradition, I could say that's what I'm doing. Now, do I mean that writing a book of shadows is something for beginners, and when you become an experienced elder expert like myself, you don't need a book of shadows anymore? No, that's not what I'm saying. Many of the leaders of Wicca and the pagan community in general have kept extensive books of shadows. What I am saying is that you should do what works for you. If keeping your book of shadows in a simple, inexpensive 3-ring binder works, well then do it. If you're a kind of person who likes something a little more decorative, a little more artsy, something more like a pagan spiritual scrapbook, then maybe buying one of the commercially produced or even making your own scrapbook type book of shadows might be the thing to do. I've seen people that have done the old physical cut and paste and sort of decoupaged things into their book of shadows, and it's really a pretty work. It's a work of art. If that's what you enjoy doing, then that's what you should do. If doing it on your computer or your laptop is more convenient and it works for you, then you should do that. If there comes some times when your book of shadow work sort of becomes dormant, I don't think that you should feel guilty about it. Ours is not a religion of guilt, but of joy and celebration. And if you reach a time when that book of shadow dormancy kind of stretches out, I don't think you should feel guilty about that either. I think you should try a lot of things and see what works for you. Well, that's just my opinion. I could be wrong. So till next time, Dancing Rabbit, wishing you peace.